There are stories that live quietly on the shelf, and then there are stories that refuse to die. Dracula is one of those, the kind that doesn't just knock on your door but waits for you to open it yourself. Published in 1897, Dracula was written by the Irish author Bram Stoker, a man who spent most of his life backstage at London's Lyceum Theatre, managing actors and imagining shadows. He was not a famous novelist in his time. In fact, his earlier books barely sold. Yet this one, the strange tale of a Transylvanian count with burning eyes and impeccable manners, would become one of the most influential novels in modern history. It changed horror forever, gave birth to a myth that has walked through film, theater, has television, and even video games. Bram Stoker himself never saw the fame that came later. He died in modest obscurity in 1912, long before Bela Lugosi's smooth Hungarian accent would make "I never drink wine" echo through cinema halls. Today, Dracula is taught in universities, celebrated as a masterpiece of Gothic literature, and recognized by the Modern Library and Time magazine as one of the most important novels of the past century. And listen to this moment from early in the book, where Jonathan Harker first feels the trap closing in. The castle is on the very edge of a terrible precipice. A stone falling from the window would fall 1,000 feet before it struck the valley below. You can almost hear the silence between those words, the kind of silence that lives just before fear begins. So, welcome to Echoes of Books. If you enjoy wandering through dark corridors with a lantern of curiosity, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, or even support us through a small donation. Every gesture keeps this little library of echoes alive. Now, shall we open the coffin and step inside the story? Imagine a Europe at the turn of the 19th century, when steam engines and telegrams promised that reason could conquer anything. And yet, somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, the map begins to blur. It's here that Dracula begins, not with lightning or thunder, but with a young man on a train. Jonathan Harker, a polite English solicitor, is traveling to Transylvania to help an eccentric nobleman purchase property in London. He records everything in his journal, his handwriting neat, his tone rational. But the further east he travels, the more the world slips away from logic. The villagers cross themselves when he speaks Count Dracula's name. Wolves howl in the distance. A carriage arrives at midnight, driven by a coachman with unnaturally strong hands. When the castle gates close behind Harker, we realize, along with him, that he's not a guest at all, but a prisoner. Inside the castle, time loses its shape. The Count is courteous, even charming. He's tall, pale, with eyes that seem to glow when the candles dim. He never eats. He never sleeps at night. When Harker cuts himself shaving, Dracula lunges like an animal before regaining his composure with an apology too smooth to be human. There's a moment when Harker writes, "I fear I am the only living soul within these walls." And the word living suddenly feels heavy. After a narrow escape, Harker returns to England, half mad but alive. But something else has crossed the sea with him. A ship runs aground in the seaside town of Whitby. The crew is dead, their bodies drained. A large dog leaps ashore and vanishes. Only one name appears in the captain's log, Dracula. Here the story widens, told through the letters and diaries of Harker's fiancée, Mina Murray, her friend Lucy Westenra, and the men who orbit them. Lucy is beautiful, innocent, and newly engaged to the noble Arthur Holmwood. But soon she begins to waste away, her skin turning translucent, her sleep restless. 2 tiny marks bloom on her neck. Doctors fail to find a cure. One of them, Dr. John Seward, consults his old mentor, Professor Abraham Van Helsing, a Dutch polymath who knows that science sometimes needs faith to survive. Van Helsing's diagnosis is chilling. Lucy is being drained, not by illness, but by something ancient. They try blood transfusions, prayers, garlic, and crosses. Nothing works. One night, she dies. And yet, days later, children begin disappearing near the churchyard. The witnesses describe a pale woman with lips of scarlet and eyes of hellfire. When Van Helsing and his companions confront her, she smiles, soft, seductive, hungry. With trembling mercy, they end her suffering, and the Lucy they knew fades like morning mist. Grief turns into determination. Mina, calm and intelligent, begins compiling everyone's notes into a single file, a proto-database of fear. But Dracula, sensing her strength, targets her next. He enters her room in the night. She wakes with blood on her lips and whispers, "Unclean, unclean." The line cuts through the book like a prayer turned confession. The group, Harker, Mina, Van Helsing, Seward, Holmwood, and the brave Texan Quincy Morris, form a brotherhood of light against the darkness. They study railway timetables, maps, and folklore, chasing the Count through the fog of London and back across Europe. Mina's connection to Dracula becomes both curse and compass. She can sense his movements, yet he can invade her dreams. As they near Transylvania, the story tightens like a heartbeat before the final note. The hunters catch Dracula's carriage at sunset. Quincy Morris is mortally wounded, but not before driving a knife into the Count's heart. Dracula's body turns to dust, and Mina feels the mark lift from her soul. She looks at the dying Quincy and writes later, "His blood was on my lips when I knew freedom." The novel closes years later with a sense of quiet, almost sacred relief. Evil has been defeated, or perhaps merely contained. Jonathan and Mina have a son, and they name him after the men who died fighting the darkness. But even as the pages end, there's a lingering unease, because Dracula never really leaves. He exists wherever fear meets fascination, where love brushes against death and refuses to turn away. If we listen closely, every journal entry in the book feels like a voice speaking to us across time, saying, "This happened. Believe me." And perhaps that's why Dracula still feels alive. It's written not as fiction, but as evidence. Evidence that the supernatural is just another word for what we cannot yet explain. Now that we've crossed the story's threshold, let's step deeper into its hidden architecture, the fears, desires, and philosophies pulsing beneath its surface. Because behind every coffin lid, there's a mirror waiting to open. Structure as trap, the epistolary maze. When you open Dracula, you're not entering a story in the usual sense. You're entering a collection of documents, diaries or letters, telegrams, news clippings, and even phonograph recordings. It's as if Bram Stoker didn't want to tell the tale himself. He wanted the reader to assemble it, piece by piece, like an archaeologist brushing away layers of fear. This choice is more than a stylistic experiment. It's the mechanism that makes the novel feel real, almost disturbingly so. From the very first pages, Jonathan Harker's journal introduces us to this methodical structure. We read his thoughts, see his polite English optimism curdle into dread, and then silence. His diary stops abruptly when he realizes he's a prisoner. That pause in narration, that blank space between one entry and the next, becomes its own kind of scream. And just as we're left holding our breath, another voice picks up the thread. Mina's letters, Lucy's diary, Doctor. Seward's phonograph recordings. Each new perspective widens the net, pulling us deeper into a labyrinth of fragmented truths. The effect is brilliant. Stoker turns us into detectives. Every entry feels like evidence, every omission a mystery. He makes the reader complicit. We're not passive observers, we're participants, piecing together horror from secondhand words. And that's where the tension lies. Because as the story unfolds, we begin to sense that knowledge itself, the act of documenting, is dangerous. Writing becomes both salvation and infection. Take Mina, for instance. Her typewriter clicks through the night as she transcribes everyone's journals into a master file. She believes that knowledge will save them. But this act of gathering, of uniting voices, also makes her vulnerable. When Dracula later invades her mind, it's as if he's entered not just her body, but the entire archive, the library of their fear. Stoker's genius is to make the form mirror the threat. The vampire isn't only drinking blood, he's feeding on information, on the modern obsession with recording everything. It's no coincidence that the novel appears in the age of the telegram, the phonograph, and the typewriter, machines that promise precision and truth. Stoker's characters use these technologies to wage war against superstition, believing that if they can just gather enough data, they can defeat the darkness. But Dracula turns that logic inside out. The more they document, the more fragile they become. The diary, meant to bring order, becomes a haunted object. The typewriter, a weapon of clarity, becomes a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the night. Even the structure of the novel mimics the vampire's rhythm. Each entry ends abruptly, each letter interrupted by urgency or fear. We move from calm reflection to sudden terror, from rationality to delirium, again and again. It's a heartbeat pattern, the pulse of dread. You could say that the novel breathes, inhaling reason, exhaling horror, and beneath that rhythm lies a subtle question: who is controlling this narrative? Every voice in Dracula is mediated, edited, translated. Van Helsing's broken English, for example, is both comic and tragic. His words stumble, but his wisdom cuts through. It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says, there is nothing to explain. His fragmented speech becomes a metaphor for the whole novel, a patchwork of partial understandings stitched together in desperation. The ending seals this theme beautifully. Mina compiles the final record, noting that the story we've just read is an edited collection, cleansed of superfluous details. But the reader knows that no archive is ever complete. There are always missing pages, burnt letters, silences that hum louder than words. And so Dracula closes not with certainty, but with a question mark disguised as peace. What Stoker gives us, through this epistolary maze, is a vision of modern anxiety. In a century that worshipped documentation, he warned that truth could be fractured. That language could trap as easily as it could liberate. His structure is a cage made of paper, a castle built from ink, and once you enter, you're never quite sure whether you're reading a story or whether the story is reading you. In this way, Dracula isn't just a Gothic novel, it's an experiment in perspective, in how fear multiplies when divided among voices. The Count may be the villain, but the true horror lies in the echo, the endless repetition of testimony, the frantic attempt to prove that the unbelievable happened. Every time a reader opens the book, they join the chorus, adding one more voice to the file. And maybe that's why the legend never dies, because we keep transcribing it, century after century. Science versus superstition, when progress meets the abyss. If Dracula had been written a few decades earlier, it might have been a medieval ghost story. But Bram Stoker chose to set his nightmare in the age of science. Telegraphs clicked. Blood transfusions were new wonders. Phonographs could capture voices in spinning grooves of wax. England was convinced that the future was rational and illuminated by electricity. And then, along came Count Dracula, a creature older than civilization, who slipped through locked doors and reduced the Empire's confidence to a whisper. What makes the novel fascinating is not simply that superstition and science collide, but that they depend on each other. The group of hunters who pursue the Count are all modern men. Doctor. Seward runs a psychiatric asylum and records his patients' voices on phonograph cylinders. Jonathan Harker is a solicitor trained in contracts and evidence. Arthur Holmwood is nobility, educated and respectable. They believe in medicine, law, and facts. Yet none of these can protect them from the ancient shadow that crosses the sea inside a coffin. Enter Van Helsing, half professor, half priest, whose faith bridges the gap. He performs blood transfusions and sprinkles holy water in the same evening. He calls upon the cross as readily as he cites medical texts. When he tells Seward that it is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, he isn't rejecting reason, he's rescuing it from arrogance. For Stoker, the real danger isn't the supernatural itself. It's the belief that humanity can explain everything. The Count thrives in that overconfidence, moving unseen precisely because modern minds no longer look for monsters. The transfusion scenes are among the most charged moments in the book. 4 men, Seward, Arthur, Van Helsing, and Quincy Morris, each give their blood to save Lucy. It's both medical procedure and sacred ritual, science disguised as sacrament. Their efforts fail not because medicine is useless, but because the disease they face isn't of the body alone. Stoker was writing in the same decade that germ theory was transforming hospitals, but he sensed something those theories missed, that fear, lust, and faith spread faster than any contagion. Lucy's infection is a metaphor for every moral panic of the century: syphilis, hysteria, even the anxiety over female independence. When Van Helsing finally confronts Dracula, the conflict feels almost theological. The scientist becomes an exorcist. He must accept that his instruments are useless unless accompanied by belief. Notice how the narrative blends the language of experiment with that of prayer. Mina types reports as if filing divine evidence. Telegrams and crucifixes coexist comfortably. The line between laboratory and chapel disappears. This duality is what gives Dracula its enduring power. It's not a rejection of modernity, but a warning that progress without humility can become its own superstition. The novel whispers, you can catalog the world, you can measure the blood, but you cannot measure the soul. And in that unmeasured space, the vampire waits. There's a small but striking detail that readers often overlook. Dracula himself uses modern tools. He hires a lawyer, reads train schedules, ships boxes across borders with logistical precision. He's not the dusty remnant of the past. He's the dark twin of progress, the predator who adapts faster than those who hunt him. Every new technology that humanity invents becomes another doorway he can enter. In that sense, he's a perfect emblem of the industrial age, efficient, global, unstoppable. Think of the scene where Mina, under Dracula's influence, writes her notes in trance-like submission. Her rational, mechanical typewriter becomes an instrument of possession. Knowledge is no longer protection, it's vulnerability. The more data the group collects, the closer the vampire gets. Stoker seems to anticipate the modern paradox. The tools that enlighten us also expose us. The final chase across Europe drives this theme home. Trains, maps, telegraphs, all the marvels of civilization become the stage for an ancient ritual. Technology may speed the hunter's pursuit, but victory still depends on symbols carved before history began. The Count is destroyed not by science, but by faith wielded with precision. Steel meets wood, but wood wins, the stake over the scalpel. So what is Stoker telling us? That knowledge must walk hand in hand with mystery, that progress should bow, at least occasionally, to reverence. The fear that hums through Dracula isn't just the fear of death, it's the fear that the universe might still contain secrets, and that human reason, magnificent as it is, will never illuminate them all. Today, in a world of algorithms and vaccines, we might smile at those old crucifixes and garlic flowers. But deep down, we recognize the same tension. We still live between microscope and miracle, between data and dream. And when the power flickers, when the internet dies and the room falls silent, the old part of us, the part that once huddled around firelight, still listens for wings in the dark. Desire and contamination, the Gothic body. Every horror story hides a secret desire, and in Dracula, that desire is written across every wound, every whisper, every trembling heartbeat. Beneath the cobwebs and crucifixes, this is a novel about bodies, hungry, trembling, forbidden bodies, and the way society tries to keep them pure. Stoker's genius is that he never says this outright. He lets the language blush on its own. Take Lucy Westenra. In the beginning, she's described as angelic, gentle, everything Victorian womanhood admired. She receives 3 marriage proposals in one day and writes to Mina, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her?" The line seems innocent, almost playful, but it ripples with suppressed longing. Lucy becomes the novel's moral testing ground, the place where affection, appetite, and fear collide. When she falls ill, it isn't because of a fever or infection, but because something unseen comes to her window each night. The symptoms are physical, blood loss, weakness, but the atmosphere around her is unmistakably erotic. The men who love her take turns giving their blood, in a series of transfusions that are both medical and intimate. Each act saves her for a moment, and yet deepens her doom. The boundaries blur, whose blood is whose desire saves, and whose desire kills. Stoker never names it, but he paints it vividly. The night Lucy rises from her coffin, dressed in white, her lips red, her voice soft as silk, she's both terrifying and magnetic. Van Helsing calls her unclean, but the word carries more than moral judgment. It's the language of taboo, of what cannot be spoken in polite society. When the men drive the stake through her heart, the text describes her transformation not as monstrous, but as serene. The body shook and quivered and twisted, Stoker writes. Then the awful scream came, but the face was of Lucy as we had seen her in her days of sweet purity. Salvation and violation happen in the same instant. That duality, desire and disgust intertwined, is the pulse of Gothic fiction. In Dracula, blood becomes the novel's central metaphor, a bridge between life and lust, between what is shared and what is forbidden. To drink blood is to take another's essence, to blur individuality. It's intimate, invasive, and deeply sensual. Dracula's feeding is not just murder, it's seduction. When he bends over Mina, Stoker writes, with his left hand he held both her hands, keeping them away from her lips, and with his right, he seized her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. It reads like both assault and communion. The horror comes not only from the violence, but from the strange tenderness beneath it. Victorian readers might not have spoken openly about desire, but they could feel its shadow in every line. Stoker gives them a story where repression itself becomes the monster. Dracula doesn't create lust, he releases it. He's the foreign tempter, the otherness that gives form to what the English characters fear in themselves. He invades bedrooms, dissolves boundaries, makes saints crave the forbidden. Yet even as they destroy him, there's an unspoken melancholy in their victory. Something inside them, something alive, dies with him. Mina's experience deepens this theme. When she's forced to drink Dracula's blood, the act feels almost like marriage by inversion. She becomes his bride, linked to him across distance and dream. But unlike Lucy, Mina's strength lies in her reason. She remains composed, methodical, using intellect to counter the darkness within. She's the synthesis of two worlds, the rational and the emotional, the pure and the impure. Through her, Stoker suggests that redemption might not mean purging desire, but acknowledging it without surrender. That's why Dracula remains so modern. It understands that fear and attraction are siblings, that we often chase what terrifies us, that the same force that corrupts can also awaken. The vampire is not just a predator, He's a mirror held to the body's unspoken truth. Even the language Stoker uses vibrates with double meanings: blood, kiss, thirst, possession. It's no accident that readers remember not the violence, but the intimacy. The novel whispers the question most Gothic tales avoid: is purity truly the opposite of sin, or just another mask for desire? When the hunters at last destroy Dracula, their relief feels strangely hollow. The danger is gone, but so is the fever. The house is clean, the beds are safe, but something electric, something alive, has vanished. As if the story itself has returned to the same repression it began with. That's the hidden genius of Dracula. It gives readers permission to feel what their society forbade, then politely restores order by the final page. Yet the tremor lingers. The reader closes the book, calm on the surface, but somewhere deep inside, something stirs, a pulse, a whisper, a quiet hunger, empire, otherness, and the fear of return. Every empire tells itself a bedtime story. It's usually about order, progress, and civilization marching bravely into the unknown. But underneath the lullaby, there's always a quieter voice whispering a question: what happens when the unknown marches back? That's the unease at the heart of Dracula. Behind the fangs and fog, it's a story about an empire afraid of its own shadow. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, the British Empire covered a quarter of the planet. London was the center of the world. Trains and telegraphs stitched continents together, and the Victorians believed they had tamed both nature and history. Yet the same empire that conquered foreign lands was haunted by the fear that those lands might conquer it in return. Reverse colonization. Later critics called it a nightmare of the colonized coming home. Dracula, sailing from Transylvania to Whitby with boxes of native soil, is that nightmare given a face? Think of his journey, an immigrant crossing borders, bringing ancient customs and strange appetites to the heart of England. He infiltrates politely, buying real estate through a solicitor, learning local speech, adopting new clothes. But beneath his manners lies the threat of contamination, the fear that the purity of the British race, that beloved phrase of the era, might be eroded from within. The novel's imagery makes it plain: blood, invasion, infection. The Empire's borders, both geographic and moral, are porous. The Count doesn't storm England, he's invited in. Like all good vampires, he needs permission to cross the threshold. And that, perhaps, is Stoker's slyest metaphor. Britain's anxieties are self-inflicted. The Empire's greed for expansion opens doors that cannot easily be closed. It's worth remembering that Bram Stoker was Irish. He lived in London, but carried in his veins the experience of a people colonized by the same empire his characters defend. His Count isn't just an Eastern European bogeyman. He's a projection of British guilt and fascination with the exotic. The Victorians looked eastward and southward for mystery, sensuality, and danger, and Stoker distilled all of that into his aristocratic predator. In this sense, Dracula is the Empire's repressed desire made flesh, the thing it both fears and secretly envies. Look closely and you'll see that the hero's pursuit of Dracula reads like a colonial campaign in miniature. They map his movements, record his habits, translate his language, even study his folklore. Knowledge becomes conquest, superstition becomes surveillance. When they chase him back to Transylvania, they are reclaiming territory, restoring order to the edges of their mental map. It's as if the Empire must kill its own reflection to preserve its story of progress. Yet Stoker's tone is not triumphal. There's melancholy in the ending, a sense that the hunter's victory comes at a spiritual cost. The landscapes of the East, the Carpathians, the mists, the ancient soil linger in the reader's mind long after the Count turns to dust. The book ends in London, but the imagination stays abroad. That lingering fascination suggests the Empire cannot fully banish what it fears. It remains drawn to the very darkness it pretends to conquer. And Dracula himself, when viewed through a post-colonial lens, becomes strangely sympathetic. He's a displaced nobleman, the last remnant of a dying aristocracy, defending his homeland through predation because it's the only form of power left to him. His immortality is a curse born of survival. The Empire paints him as monster, but his hunger mirrors its own, the hunger to consume, to possess, to endure. The language Stoker uses to describe the Count reinforces this doubling. He's often compared to a wild beast or creature of the night, echoing the racialized vocabulary of colonial travel writing. The English characters describe him in terms of difference, his accent, his gestures, his foreign manners, as if labeling him could keep him at bay. But labeling, in Dracula, always fails. The unknown refuses to stay neatly categorized. The Count speaks flawless English. He moves among them unseen. He uses their laws and trains and telegrams. He becomes the very image of modern efficiency, simply turned toward older appetites. One could say the novel isn't just about East invading West, it's about the West discovering the East inside itself. That's why the fear feels so intimate. The vampire is not a stranger. He's the Empire's own reflection, sharpened by guilt and longing. Every time the English characters talk about cleansing or purifying the land, we hear the echo of colonial rhetoric, the language of moral hygiene. And yet, beneath it runs a darker current of fascination. Dracula is evil, yes, but he's also free. He lives beyond the codes that bind his pursuers. He crosses boundaries they only dream of crossing. That's the quiet subversion in Stoker's story. The supposed villains, the foreigners, the women who awaken, the madman Renfield who listens to instincts, carry the spark of vitality. The heroes preserve order, but in doing so, they turn pale, almost ghost-like themselves. It's as if the price of purity is lifelessness. So when we read Dracula today, in a global world still negotiating borders and identities, we can feel its relevance pulse anew. The fear of invasion has changed names, but not shape. Whether it's immigration, sound technology, or cultural change, the tension between self and other continues. And Stoker's novel asks us, very quietly, what if the monster you fear most is simply your history returning home? Immortality and the modern condition, why Dracula endures asterisk. Every generation thinks it has finally escaped its ghosts. Yet somehow, Dracula keeps rising from the grave, new century, new costume, same hunger. And maybe that's because Stoker's vampire isn't really about death at all. He's about the longing to outlive it. At its core, Dracula is a meditation on immortality, not the sparkling kind sold by Hollywood, but the unsettling, lonely, decaying kind. The Count doesn't live forever, he endures forever. His immortality isn't youth, but paralysis. He never grows, never learns, never loves in the human sense. He survives through consumption, draining others to preserve his own existence. It's an eerie metaphor for the modern world's obsession with preservation, of wealth, of power, of image. Stoker may not have known it, but he was describing the early symptoms of our age, the fear of time, the refusal to fade. Think about it. The Victorians were terrified of degeneration, the idea that civilization might rot from within, that progress could run backward. Dracula takes that anxiety and gives it fangs. He's both corpse and conqueror, aristocrat and parasite. He represents the past refusing to die, clinging to life through exploitation. It's no accident that he's a count, a literal embodiment of inherited power feeding off the young. When he preys on Lucy, he's not just stealing blood, he's stealing vitality, future, and renewal. Every drop he takes is a delay of his own decay. And yet, paradoxically, He's also a symbol of desire that refuses to vanish. His immortality carries the ache of eternity. You can feel it in his first conversation with Harker, when he speaks of the centuries that have passed like sand through fingers. The line is wistful, almost sad. Behind the predator's grin is the melancholy of someone who has seen too much and felt too little. The true curse of eternal life is not damnation, it's repetition. And repetition is the most modern torment of all. That's why the vampire continues to fascinate us. He's the mirror of our cultural moment, reflecting whatever we most fear losing or becoming. In the 20th century, Dracula became a metaphor for disease. The blood exchanges that once hinted at sexuality were now read through the lens of contagion, AIDS and infection, the fragility of the body. In the 21st, he's become a symbol of capitalism and addiction, the endless thirst that drives us to consume even when we know it's killing us. He's the perfect immortal for the age of streaming, scrolling, and sleeplessness, feeding, always feeding. Stoker's novel anticipates this with uncanny precision. His vampire isn't a ghost from the past. He's a prototype of modern anxiety. He travels globally, manipulates logistics, masters technology. He's patient, adaptable, data-driven. The letters and diaries that once contained him have multiplied into servers and clouds. We still collect, document, record, believing that information will save us from the dark. But as Stoker warned, the more we record, the less we seem to remember. The archive grows, and yet meaning slips through our fingers. In that sense, Dracula has already won. He's not hiding in castles anymore. He's in our algorithms, whispering, just one more. And yet there's another, gentler layer beneath all this dread. Stoker gives us a counterpoint in Mina Harker, the one character who faces the vampire's influence without losing her soul. She's the modern conscience, organized, intelligent, compassionate. When she says, "We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters when the mother spirit is invoked," she's speaking for humanity itself. Her redemption comes not from purity, but from empathy, the ability to see the monster and still want to understand it. That's what saves her, and perhaps what saves the book from despair. By the time the hunters destroy Dracula, the reader feels an unexpected tenderness. He turns to dust quietly, almost gratefully, as if released from an endless burden. There's no thunder, no fire, just silence. And in that silence lies the novel's deepest truth. Immortality is not triumph, it's tragedy. To live without change is to live without life. The very thing we fear most, death, is also the thing that gives meaning to our days. Dracula's immortality is a warning carved in the shape of a man. Be careful what you wish for when you wish to last forever. That's why he endures. Not because he's frightening, but because he's familiar. Because every time we check the mirror, half hoping to find no reflection, we're really asking the same question. What part of me is already undead? The part that won't let go of control, of youth, of perfection. The part that fears time's bite more than death's embrace. More than a century later, Stoker's story still feels alive because it isn't just about a monster, it's about the human refusal to surrender. In the Count's eyes, we see our own endless motion, working, saving, scrolling, feeding, trying to stay awake while the night quietly claims us. And so, after all the coffins, the maps, the garlic, and the trembling hands clutching crucifixes, what does Dracula really leave us with? Not just a story of evil defeated, but a meditation on what it means to be human in the face of our own shadows. Every part of the novel, its fractured structure, its feverish blend of science and superstition, its dance between desire and denial, reminds us that the boundaries we draw around ourselves are far more fragile than we think. The men in the story believe they are hunting a monster, but in truth, they are chasing the limits of their own understanding. What terrifies them isn't only the vampire outside the window, it's the revelation that the darkness might also live inside. Bram Stoker never wrote another book that matched the power of Dracula. Some say he was haunted by it, that he poured every secret, every fear, every fascination he had into this one creation. And perhaps that's why it endures. The novel doesn't just frighten, it invites reflection. It asks what happens when progress forgets wonder, when purity turns cruel, when desire is denied until it devours us. The book's final note, Mina and Jonathan's quiet domestic peace, feels tender, yet uneasy. Evil has been defeated, yes, but its ashes linger in memory. The hunters return to the light, but they never quite look the same again. Maybe that's the truth of every confrontation with the unknown. We survive it, but it leaves a mark. Even now, more than a century later, Dracula refuses to rest. He keeps changing shape, from aristocrat to outsider, from predator to tragic lover, from nightmare to cultural metaphor. He's the part of us that refuses to disappear, the one whispering that fear is not the opposite of love, but its shadow. Perhaps that's the real reason we keep inviting him back, because as long as we tell his story, we're not just warding off the dark, we're learning to see in it. So as you close this story tonight, or maybe watch this essay in the small hours when the house is quiet, consider this. Do you think Dracula is truly about conquering darkness, or about learning to live with it? If that question lingers, then the story has done its work. Thank you for spending time in this conversation with me here at Echoes of Books. If this journey through Bram Stoker's immortal creation stirred something in you, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or even leaving a comment with your own reflection on what the vampire means to you today. Until next time, keep reading between the heartbeats.